Today, I have Carl McColman with me. And Carl, you do a lot of really cool things in the world, including you just recently released an incredible book called The Big Book of Christian Mysticism, The Essential Guide to Contemplative Spirituality. So excited to talk about Christian mysticism on this podcast. I don't know, I'm trying to think through I've had over 150 episodes now. I have no idea if I've ever talked with somebody about Christian mysticism, but I'm very stoked to chat with you about it. So, with all of that said, before we chat about the book, I want to hear from you. Who is Carl McColman to Carl McColman?
What a great question. Um, I'm I'm me. I'm a contemplative or an aspiring contemplative, I should say. I am, gosh, what can I say about myself? I could give you the dog and pony show. I'm a writer, I'm a blogger, I'm a podcaster, yada yada yada. I have a spiritual direction ministry, all that stuff. Uh, you can get all that on my website. So maybe, digging a little bit deeper, I'm a vegan, but I'm what I
Mm.
call a slacker vegan because I do cheat some. So,
Oh, what's your
there you go.
best what's your favorite cheat food in that when it comes to slacking?
Oh, that's a great question. Probably something involving sugar that really isn't good for me. Well, I'll give you a good example is Guinness.
Oh,
Guinness is not a vegetarian food.
really?
They actually use fish in the production. So I mean, it's almost like cheese, how cheese uses rennet. There's
Right.
something about fish intestines. I don't know the details. You have to maybe that's a future episode for you, is to have
Yeah,
somebody in to talk about the theology of Guinness.
well,
But
it's not very. Are you originally an Irishman? I feel like Irish people should, or I guess is Guinness Scottish or Irish? I always forget.
Guinness is Irish. It's from
It is.
Dublin. McColman
Is Mick Coleman not
is
a Irish name?
it's a Scottish name, but
Oh,
the story is that the Scots Gaels, the Gaelic Scots, probably all emigrated from Ireland. So if you go back far enough, all roads lead to Ireland. But
that's right.
but I've been a faithful, imbiber of the Guinness since I was in college. My freshman year in college, I think, was when I was initiated into the Sacred Order of Guinness.
Right.
And so when I learned that it was not technically a vegetarian food, it was a bit of an existential crisis.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and then, but I think, that God used that to help me to understand that sometimes you have to bend the rules a little. And
That's
so,
right.
like I said,
That's right.
slacker vegan here. So,
What
but
good is grace if you can't sin a little, right?
we're getting into some theologically thin ice, but hey, why not? It's a Monday morning here. So,
That's great.
um,
That's great. Well, let's chat about the book. Before we
okay.
dive into the contents of the book, and I've got lots of questions about just kind of generally what you talk a little bit about, lots of questions around Christian mysticism. Before we get into all of that, though, I want to know if there's something that you maybe learned historically or theologically as you wrote this book. Obviously, you're probably going into writing, when you go into writing a book about Christian mysticism, you probably have a good sense of what Christian mysticism is, the history, some of the theology that you might already know a little bit. But was there anything as you were maybe doing some research for this book where you're like, wow, did
Hmm.
not know about that before? Might need to put that in the book. Or maybe you didn't, but
Yeah,
anything new that came up?
that's a rich question. And one thing I should also point out is that this is the second edition of the book. So we had a first edition in
Oh,
2010. That cover is my kind of a brown cover. Then the new edition, it's more colorful, and
right,
that just came out 3 or 4 months ago. So it's called the New Big Book of Christian Mysticism. And so the new book is 100 pages longer, about 30,000 words longer. So it's not only revised, it's
wow,
revised and expanded. But to get back to your question, so I think the challenge for me is that I am a little bit of a perpetual student, and I'm continually just trying to, just deepen my own knowledge base in terms of my reading, in terms of engaging with, other teachers, or, whatever the situation may be. So it's just off the top of my head, I can't think of an oh wow moment specifically while writing the book. But there certainly have been a number of oh wow moments, you know, over the years. And so, well, I'll give you a recent one, and it's actually come since the book was finished. But just I'm a bear of little brain. That's what comes to mind, so that's what you're going to get. there's an amazing theologian, mystical theologian named Howard Thurman. Many people will
Mm-hmm.
be familiar with Howard Thurman. Many may not be familiar. Howard Thurman was an African American Baptist minister, and you don't often think of Black Baptist preachers as Christian mystics, but he certainly was. He studied mysticism under Rufus Jones, who was a very well-known Quaker kind of scholar of Christian mysticism. And then, of course, he made it his own and really brought the spirituality of the contemplative tradition into his experience as an African American living in, I mean, his grandmother was a slave, being born into the long shadow of the trauma of American slavery and the
Mm-hmm.
realities of Jim Crow segregation. So, so he lived from, I think, 1899, I believe, 98 or 99, very end of the 19th century, dies in 1981. So, one of the regrets of my life is, I could have met him had our paths crossed, and but
Mm.
at any rate, um, it's like I know people who knew Merton, I know people who knew Thurman, and it's always amazing to be able to talk to somebody who had that
Mm-hmm.
connection. But back to Thurman. So, his mysticism is a mysticism steeped in social justice and steeped in
Mm-hmm.
the mandate to dismantle oppression. And and he's writing about this in the 30s and 40s. I mean, something that I think a lot of kind of middle class white American Christians, it really didn't get on our radar until later because we were what's the word, kind of insulated by our
Right.
social privilege. Whereas obviously somebody who doesn't have social privilege, they have a front row seat to the injustice and oppression that happens in our culture. So Thurman is writing about things in the 30s and 40s that maybe other people who have a more privileged life don't even start thinking about
Right.
until generations later. In 1938, so Thurman is what, midlife, late 30s or so. I think he was a chaplain at Howard University. He gives a talk on mysticism, and he basically says that, and I'm paraphrasing here because I don't have the quote in front of me, but he basically says, while mystics are committed to community because Jesus taught community, love your neighbor as yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You can't get away from community. But the mystic is not, I think he said, is no friend of the institution. He's
Mm.
saying this in the 30s. And I'm reading this and I'm like, he just predicted spiritual but not religious by only what, about
Mm.
50 years. you know and that when we think about today, so many, I mean, I'm a young boomer. It's like with each generation, from boomer to X to millennial to what, Y, Z, whatever, every generation, more and more people are saying no thank you to the institution.
Mm.
And what I saw Thurman say in that one little line from that one little talk he gave, 85 years ago, he was saying that disaffiliating from the institution can actually be a mystical act. That
Mm.
that can be, you know, led by a desire to move more deeply into the mystery of Christ. And
Mm-hmm.
so, obviously, there are lots of reasons why people disaffiliate from the institution. People disaffiliate because they're bored. They disaffiliate because they don't want to be told what to do. They disaffiliate because they're queer and they are sick and tired of being told they're bad people because they're queer. Many, many, many different reasons why people
Right.
disaffiliate. But Thurman points out this can actually be an outgrowth of a deep interior life, and
Mm.
that was this kind of major aha moment for me.
That's
And
amazing.
again,
I
certainly tracked with some of my own
Yeah,
experience.
I definitely want. I actually have a question around that. The church authority and its sort of interesting relationship with Christian mysticism throughout history. But before we dive into all of that, that'll be later on. So we'll bookmark that for now. But uh,
Okay.
that's an incredible revelation that you have as you're, again, doing some kind of research for this book. Obviously, being a contemplative, I'm imagining you're probably a person that is maybe discovering more things about yourself as you go on in life, right? And so I would imagine doing some sort of project like writing the new book, the new big book of Christian mysticism, that you're finding more about yourself. You're not only just learning things about maybe Howard Thurman or other things when you're writing a book like this, I'm sure you're also learning about yourself. So, was there anything that came up while writing this book? Maybe it was from, however, was it 10 or so years ago when you wrote the original version, and then now obviously there's this new edition. But was there anything that came up in the writing of this book that you were like, wow, didn't know this about myself before?
About myself. I think I'm going to answer in a broader sense rather than, again, trying to zero in on any one specific
Hmm.
moment. But I think, and I'm really conscious of the name of this podcast, People's Theology. And what I would argue to begin with is that I think we have a tendency, especially in the West and especially since the Reformation, to see spirituality and theology as separate.
Mm.
And it's like theology is of the head. Theology is academic. It's doctrinal. That kind of thing. It's philosophical. Mysticism is devotional. It's affective. Not effective, affective. It's of the heart. It's all about falling in love with God. It's about being the bride of Christ. That kind of thing. So we've created these kind of parallel discourses. And Merton said the separation of theology from spirituality is a disaster. And I would agree with him wholeheartedly. So the first thing I want to say is that I think mysticism at its best is theology, and theology at its
Mm.
best is mystical. So I just want to throw that in there. Now let's go back to your question. How did my kind of research into Christian mysticism impact my sense of self or my own interior faith life? And I don't know that I could quantify that because I think
Mm.
my faith journey. Well, just to give you kind of again the quick rundown, I was introduced to the topic of mysticism in 1979 when a friend of mine gave me Evelyn Underhill's book on mysticism, which was written in 1911. So even then, at that point, the book is already almost 70 years old, but
Hmm.
still, it was very fresh and it really spoke to me. And she does take a historical perspective, which is probably one of the reasons why I'm so interested in the history of mysticism. Quoting John of the Cross, Meister Eckhart, Teresa of Avila, Julian of Norwich, just out the wazoo. Her book is just rich in terms of letting the mystics speak for themselves. Um, and it's just opened up a whole world for me because I kind of come out of, it's interesting because my parents were Lutheran. So I grew up in a very kind of, again, suburban, white, middle class, post World War II Lutheran congregation. And then I had a kind of a spontaneous spiritual awakening when I was 16 years old, very
Mm.
much in a kind of an experiential encounter with what I called God. You can't really put a name on it. And my Lutheran pastor and the people who I hung out with in the Lutheran world were not equipped to deal with that. That was off the map. So I went looking for somebody who I could talk to, and I found the Charismatic Renewal and became very much involved with charismatic Christianity. So, and okay, let's get theological. And in the charismatic world, I discovered a very dualistic, angry, restrictive God who is just an implacable judge.
Mm.
Meanwhile, Jesus, who's doing everything he can to calm daddy down so he doesn't send us to hell. And the devil is everywhere trying to trick us into disobeying God so that he gets a score. I mean, it really is a pretty messed up theology, but that was the theology that I was given. So
Hmm.
here I am in my body. I have had this mind blowing experience of God as infinite love, just pure, unadulterated compassion and care and regard, and then I'm getting this theology, this story. I mean, the word theology means talking about God. This
Hmm.
story of this punitive reward punishment dualistic model of the angry father figure. And it just, there was no way to connect them. You know, my experience was so off the map of what I was being told. But these were people who also reported having experiences of God.
Mm.
So it was a really, it basically launched me on the journey of kind of learning to articulate my own theology, and a journey that has I'm probably still on. I think I'll be on
Mm-hmm.
until the day I die. So we're talking, this is the late 70s. Now we're in the early 20s, 45-year long journey.
Mm.
So, in the spiritual direction world, we talk a lot about image of God, that every human being, even atheists, even agnostics, every human being has an image of God. What is the image of God? It's the story they tell themselves about God.
Mm.
God is ultimately beyond our language. God is a mystery. There's a quote you'll see online, and it gets attributed to Evelyn Underhill, but I've never been able to find it in her work. So I'm not sure if it's really hers or not. But this quote is, "If God were small enough to comprehend, he would be too little to worship."
Mm.
And and that is, I think, again, whoever said that first, that there's a lot of wisdom there. Now, that doesn't let us off the hook for the task of theology, that we still have an obligation to tell the best story we can
Mm-hmm.
about the God who cannot be contained by any story.
Mm.
And I think that the reality is that in the Christian tradition, we have 2,000 years of a lot of really bad stories, and including the one that I encountered with my charismatic friends when I was in high school. And so what I think that for me, the journey of discovering mysticism, reading the mystics, reading about the mystics, trying to filter that through my own experience, and then do my own writing, both as a blogger and as having written some books, is this kind of lifelong journey of how can I tell the best possible story about the one who can never be contained by any
Mm.
story.
Mm.
And so I think it makes all the difference, because the story we tell ourselves about God will shape how we see other people, will shape how we see the theology of sin and repentance. We'll see how we understand worship, how we understand justice. It literally, your image of God impacts every aspect of your spiritual life.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
but like when I do spiritual direction, both in terms of receiving spiritual direction, but also my own ministry as a spiritual director, so much of the bandwidth goes into knowing your image of God. Because frankly, I think a lot of us are given our images of God when we're very small children, or maybe when we're teenagers, and we carry that around with us for the rest of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
One definition of an atheist is somebody whose image of God has stopped working, and they've decided not to bother replacing it with a different image of God.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I do not mean any judgment for that. I think for many, many people, making the commitment to be an atheist can be an act of incredible courage. Again,
Mm-hmm.
especially when you consider what their family, or social situation may be
Yeah.
like.
Yeah.
But
I'm an atheist to many gods as well. There are many
yeah,
gods that I don't
yeah,
believe
yeah.
exist.
I attended a talk a couple of years ago, and I'll say who it was. It was Bart Campolo, Tony Campolo's
Oh.
son, and he, at least at the time, this was several years ago, so I don't know where he is today, but at the time he was identifying as an atheist. And as he was giving the talk, it became increasingly obvious to me that the God he didn't believe in, I didn't believe in either.
Mm.
So I think that's the question to ask an atheist, is tell me about the God you don't believe in, because it just might be that I don't believe in that God either.
Right.
And
Exactly.
so, back to your comment. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you just wrote you said like it was like 75,000 word book about Christian mysticism. As succinctly as possible, what is Christian mysticism?
Um, Love is real, God is love, and God dwells in your heart.
Beautiful.
That's Christian mysticism. That's the first line in the new edition of the book, and then the other 400 pages are me attempting to begin to unpack that. um, because okay, well, let's geek out a little. So mysticism comes from the same root word in Greek that we get the word mystery from, but
Mm.
also we get the word mute from. So think of the mute button on your TV remote,
Mm-hmm.
or online, if you're doing Zoom or whatever, oh, I can't hear you, you're muted.
Yep.
I
Yep.
mean, that so mute is related to silence. I mean, when I was a kid, in less kind of enlightened days, somebody who did not have the capacity to speak was regarded as a person who was mute. I mean, we that would be considered kind of disparaging today, but that was the language of the time. And so mute has this quality of silence, but also this quality of the lack of speech or the lack of discourse, if you
Mm,
will. So the mystery of mysticism is steeped in silence and steeped
mm,
in the cessation of discourse. So right away, you see the method of my madness, because I begin by saying we gotta understand mysticism in terms of theology. A lot of theologians would immediately howl in protest. If you're saying that fundamentally language is inadequate, and that to enter the door of mysticism you need to shut up. Well,
mm.
where does that leave me as a theologian?
Right.
I mean, think about
leaves you
Karl
leaves them
Rahner.
without a job is what it leaves them.
You know? So obviously there's a paradox here, and paradox is something, when you enter into the mystical funhouse, you bump into paradox almost at every corner.
Hmm.
And the paradox is that to enter into the mystery, we must be silent, and yet to share the mystery with one another, we must speak. It,
Mm,
it's the human condition. We have not mastered telepathy yet. At
mm.
least I don't know anybody who has reliably mastered
Other
that.
than
I'm sure there's some
identical
people
twins,
running.
maybe, but yeah.
Yeah, they're probably the closest. And I know there are people running around saying, "Well, I've got," and it's like, yeah, well, let's sit down with and try to measure that. But the reality is that's how we communicate. We communicate with symbols, with language, with stories, with myth, with doctrine.
Hmm.
And so it's just what we do. So the reality is, when people ask me about non-duality, I always like to talk about the North Pole, but I think it works here too. So if you're standing at the North Pole, every direction you look is south. But as soon as you take a step off of the North Pole, suddenly you have four directions.
Mm,
But you're no longer on the North Pole. It's the same thing with mysticism. Every direction you look is silent. You take one step out so that you can restore your language and try to give voice to what you're experiencing or recognizing.
hmm.
But you're away from it. Talking about it separates us from it.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so this is the paradox, the fundamental paradox of mystical writing. And I mean, when you think about the great mystics, we know about them because either they wrote or somebody wrote about them. You know, uh, Teresa of Avila wrote her Interior Castle, John of the Cross, Dark Night of the Soul, Julian of Norwich, The Revelations of Divine Love, the anonymous authors who wrote The Cloud of Unknowing or The Way of a Pilgrim. The list goes on and on and on. 20th century figures, and we've mentioned Howard Thurman, Evelyn Underhill, Merton. You could also talk about Teilhard de Chardin or Simone Weil.
Hmm.
There's all these amazing figures in our tradition who have done beautiful, poetic, often philosophically nuanced writing, attempting to articulate what cannot ultimately be articulated.
Mm,
I'm glad they tried. It seems to me that to write about the mystery is ultimately to fail. But was it G.K. Chesterton said anything worth doing is worth doing poorly?
mm,
So that's what mystics do, is they report about God poorly,
hmm.
knowing that whatever the words on a page will never ever capture the fullness
Hmm.
of the divine encounter. So
It totally makes sense by mysticism starting with silence, that mysticism and the apophatic tradition, for those that don't know, the apophatic tradition is sort of this tradition of recognizing that the less we say about God maybe is probably the best way for us to understand God. And it totally makes sense why there's that connection there. I don't want to equate the apophatic tradition with the mysticism tradition, but obviously there is some connection there. And it
well,
also reminds me a lot of, again, this recognition that what we say about the divine, that it is going to be inadequate since we are finite creatures. And it reminds me a lot of the deconstruction, like the philosophical tradition, from like Derrida and others, where they recognize that our language is inadequate to like fully describe what we're trying to describe in language. We
Yeah,
can't help but use language, right? We have to use
yeah,
language, but also recognizing that when we say words like justice or God, that those words themselves are not justice or God. They're just an attempt to describe the justice or God. And so, anyway, I find that all really
yeah.
interesting. That there's so many rich connections between uh, these mystics that may have lived 500, 600, many centuries, maybe even millennia ago, and how we see those connections still in our world today.
Yeah, and that it's even considered cutting edge. I mean, yeah,
Right?
Derrida referred to God as the transcendent signified.
Mm.
And I think a mystic would come back and say the transcendent that's also the immanent signified.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you mentioned apophatic, and anybody who learns that theological category understands its sister category is cataphatic. And
Mm-hmm.
so the idea is your discourse about God bereft of images, or is it overflowing with images? And there are cataphatic mystics too. Julian of Norwich and Teresa of Avila are two excellent examples. I think Mirabai Starr often, in her wonderful book Wild Mercy, I can't recommend that book highly enough, but I think she talks about how the feminine tradition within mysticism typically does tend to be more cataphatic. It's more the that kind of maybe philosophically austere masculine tradition, the tradition of the cloud of unknowing, of John of the Cross, of Gregory of Nyssa. Again, get into the way of a pilgrim and some of the Greek fathers, um, that tend to reach that point of almost kind of like a world weariness, and recognizing language does it fails us so much that really all that's left is silence. But I think the cataphatic tradition is kind of a healthy corrective to that, because
Mm-hmm.
it's the tradition. And Ignatius of Loyola, who again was a guy, as best as anybody knows, was also falls in that cataphatic tradition. This idea of, you know, what we see is what we've got, and that if we can't find God in the hungry person that we're helping, or in the baby that we're cooing at,
Mm.
or the dying person that we're holding their hand, you know if we can't find God here, then where are we going to find God? And
Mm-hmm.
so I think there's almost again paradox, this God is not just in the heart of the person that you are loving, and yet God is totally in the heart of the person you are loving. So it's not pantheism. The mystics have always been accused of being pantheists. Pantheism is kind of an erasing of the paradox between creator and creation.
Mm-hmm.
And so the term, I think, von Hugel coined it about 125 years ago, this concept of panentheism,
Mm-hmm.
this idea that yeah, God is not equated with all things, but yet God is present in all things. There's this
Mm-hmm.
resonant presence. But again, we cannot put it into words. But there
Mm-hmm.
is this a metaphor I continually use, is this metaphor of hide and seek, that God plays hide and seek with us. And so where is God hiding? When children play hide and seek, they hide behind a bush, they hide behind a trash can or whatever. God is hiding in the hungry person. God is hiding in the
Mm.
spouse you just had a fight with. God is hiding in the beautiful sunset. God is hiding in the litter box that you have to clean out,
Mm-hmm.
because the cats just keep on pooping. God is
Mm-hmm.
in all of the above. And so, and yet the apophatic, this tradition that says our language cannot contain God, images cannot contain God. I mean, if you think about it, the Protestant Reformation was kind of an apophatic movement. Let's tear down all the icons, let's tear down all the
Mm-hmm.
statues. And I mean, even to this day, I live in the American South. You go to a beautiful old Southern Baptist church, and it is austere. Go into a 19th century Catholic church. We do have a few down here in the South, and it is just it's an artistic overwhelm you know
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
so right there you see the apophatic and the cataphatic architecturally embedded.
Yeah.
So this idea that is God more present in a Baptist church than a Catholic church? Well, certainly some Baptists would say so. But then, is God more present in the Catholic, or how about God is simply present? And these are two different strategies
Mm-hmm.
that we adopt for trying to find the God who's playing hide and seek with
Yeah.
us.
The sort of paradox in the mystical tradition around this cataphatic and apophatic, those two traditions that we see in the mystical tradition. It also reminds me of the experiences themselves, the mystical experiences themselves, often seem to find their way into one of those two traditions. Sometimes when we hear about the mystics, there's these amazing kind of like overwhelming experiences that we sometimes hear described, and some of these mystics are doing sort of unbelievable, like I forget, I always forget which woman mystic it was, but there's a woman mystic that like would essentially almost like starve herself to like have these grand experiences with the divine. And then you have some mystics, they're almost like on the complete opposite of that, where like their mystical experiences are very unassuming. They may be even having like a mystical experience in the moment and you don't even know it, right? And so you get a little bit of both, which I find really fascinating. I don't know if you have to have much to say around that, but I'm curious what your thoughts are around the fact that
Well,
there seems to be these very different kinds of mystical experiences. Some that seem to be very grand, and then there's some that seem to be very unassuming.
the I'm not sure who said it first. I've seen it attributed to at least two different writers, two different Catholic writers. Uh, but and it's interesting. One's a Carmelite and one's a Benedictine. So coming out of the contemplative tradition in both cases. But the line goes like this: a mystic is not a special kind of person. Each person is a special kind of mystic. A mystic is not a special kind of person. Each person is a special kind of mystic. And so, what that then, of course, begs the question is, well, I'm nothing like Teresa of Avila. I'm nothing like Julian of Norwich having 16 visions on my deathbed, or Thomas Merton just suddenly falling in love with everybody because they all were shining like the sun. I mean, these amazing stories that people do recount. Carol Hauslander, who saw an icon of Christ, a Russian icon of Christ, above the sky, and then found out later that day it was the day that the Tsar had been assassinated. These
Mm.
interesting kind of stories that people tell. But then you've got Teresa Lisieux, also a Carmelite nun, who dies when she's in her 20s from tuberculosis. But her diary gets published afterwards and becomes just this kind of classic of 19th century spirituality called The Story of a Soul. And her whole thing is, can I just do little things for Christ? I'm not a great mystic like Teresa of Avila or anyone like that, but I love God, and I want to live a life that is, kind of immersed in and emerging from that love. And so, you know, who says that she can't be every bit as great a mystic as Teresa of Avila,
Mm.
but just in her own way? So Teresa had the great visions, the grand visions, the angel with the spear and all that stuff. Therese, named after Teresa, Therese just simply tries to love people and tries to be kind and compassionate and pray for those in need. The simple, simple little things. And so I think, the analogy I like to use, I love musical metaphors. So, and I am a child of the prog rock era. I grew up
Hmm.
listening to, guitarists like Jimi Hendrix and Eric Clapton, Steve Howe. These amazing, amazing, virtuosos of the guitar. I have tried to play the guitar. I know maybe two chords. As
Hey,
in
that's
mean
enough to
three
play
chords of the
some
truth.
worship music. That's all you need to know.
Some basic stuff. Okay, there you go. But um but my wife is a nice guitarist, so she would say nothing fancy, and we have, of course, a number of friends who play the guitar, but they have, with only one or two exceptions, they've never recorded, they've never been a professional musician. What if we said that the only way you could play the guitar is if you're as good as Eric Clapton or as good as Jimmy Page?
Mm.
How how much great music would be lost,
Well, that,
you
or I
know?
mean, we wouldn't have a new Eric Clapton or Jimi Hendrix, right? If nobody thought they could, ever get to that level, because
Then people would quit
obviously no one
trying.
ever starts out that good, right?
Yeah, and so the reality is that, yes, there it's like every generation, God seems to raise up a few people who are kind of like these mystical virtuosos. And in their language, their poetry, their stories, their recounting of their own experiences, their theological reflection, they inspire the rest of us.
Mm.
And then the rest of us, we still can play the guitar. We still can make music, after dinner, hey, bring out the guitar. Let's sing a few songs, that kind of thing. And the world would just be a less happy place, less joyful place if that went away. And I think that's the reality of the mystical life is some of us, a very small number of us are called to be Eric Claptons.
Mm-hmm.
And many, many, many of us are called to be like that, kid around the campfire with
Mm-hmm.
their, little, that when I was coming up is the guitar you got from Sears. I don't know what they call
Right.
entry level guitars nowadays, but it used to be you could order in the Sears catalog this good, and you hear, they not Clapton because he was in England, but these really, accomplished guitarists, and they're like, yeah, I learned on a Sears guitar,
Mm-hmm.
that my mom and dad bought for me when I was 10 years old. And
Mm-hmm.
so, isn't that wonderful? And so yeah, it's like, okay. So another thing about mystics. So, okay, doctors heal, lawyers litigate, business persons sell, musicians make music, artists paint, mystics pray. What
Mm-hmm.
do mystics do? Mystics pray. The virtuosity of the mystical life is a virtuosity of prayer. And so, and the ability to talk about, the theological reflection, to talk about not only your image of God, but then also your image of yourself. Who am I? Who am I that you created me? The Psalm 8. That's a contemplative question. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be in relationship with the infinite mystery?
Mm-hmm.
To insist both from the authority of my own experience, but also from the best teachings of the tradition, that this mystery is infinite compassion and infinite love and infinite justice, and calls us to health and calls us to healing and calls us to relationship and community. Um, in prayer, we begin to answer those questions. And so, so you think about, yeah, the Eric Claptons of the world. I mean, I heard an interview with him once, and he said, yeah, I got a guitar, and it's like my social life went out the window. I stayed at home and played the guitar for 12 hours a day, and did that for 6 or 7 years, and then finally I was good enough to go play, join a band and play. And then, of course, obviously he was gifted eventually. He's Eric Clapton. But the you know so there are some mystics who it's like they just naturally immerse their lives into prayer.
Mm-hmm.
But I think all of us are called to make our lives prayerful lives. It will
Mm-hmm.
look different for every one of us. Somebody who their career is, let's say, like a brain surgeon, they need to be absolutely present to what they're doing. you know so they're saying their prayer maybe in the morning or in the evening, that kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing, or maybe a quick little prayer: God be with me as I seek to serve this person who needs my care. you know but they're not going to be in perpetual prayer the way a meditating monk is, or
Mm-hmm.
at least the quality of their prayer will be different. But that doesn't make it any less valid in God's eyes, any less of an expression of love or an expression of compassion or care. And so, for my money, that doesn't make it any less mystical.
Mm-hmm.
We all are capable of touching the silence in some way, shape, or form. And we are all capable of opening our hearts to a sense of wonder and a sense of possibility, and to trust that the Spirit, I mean, Scripture is very explicit. The Holy Spirit has been poured into our hearts. I mean, that's Romans 5:5. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
get more plain than that. The Holy Spirit has been poured into our hearts. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to kind of turn our hearts over and allow that indwelling Spirit to transform us slowly from within?
Mm-hmm.
And that the mystical, if you want to call it an experiment, the mystical experiment dares to say, yes, I want to open my heart to that indwelling Spirit, and I want to see where it's going to take me. you know
Mm-hmm.
so
Earlier we were talking about Thurman, and you mentioned this great quote where Thurman kind of talks a little bit about the mystic kind of has this interesting relationship with the with the institution. And
yeah
we've already mentioned a little bit about some of the names that you've kind of thrown out throughout the great history of Christian mysticism. And it seems as if, I could be wrong, I'm not a scholar of Christian mysticism, but it seems as if the Christian mystics have had a complicated relationship with church authority and the church institution. Why is it that you think so many church institutions and authorities throughout history have found mysticism to even be dangerous?
yeah oh yeah I was reading something just online this morning, It was a young woman. She's working on her PhD right now, trying to make the case that Reformed theology is not hostile to mysticism. And of course, she's quoting all these authors who imply that it is. Um, and so I can tell you, again, back to my charismatic, experience in high school. I remember this guy saying, it's funny, we're still Facebook friends, although not very close, but still saying, mysticism begins in mist, it ends in schism, and it has I, not God, but I in the middle. You know, there's this kind of I don't know, like a meme. I mean, obviously, this is years before social media, but kind of this oral meme that gets passed around. And so, yeah, there is a real suspicion. And I think I can only speak for the West. I really am, I'm not a scholar of Orthodox spirituality. I mean, obviously, I've read a fair amount, but I'm certainly don't claim to be a scholar in any way. But in the East, in the West, we have the reality of the Reformation. And, even though I'm Roman Catholic, I do think the Reformation was something that needed to happen. The Catholic Church had really gone off the rails at that point, and it probably just wasn't capable of reforming itself from within. Although it certainly, once Luther lit the match, they convened the Council of Trent,
Hmm.
and good things, but also bad things came out of the council. But that's a story for a different day. But the but but like any conflict, there's casualties, and mysticism was one of the casualties of the Reformation.
Hmm.
And here's how I understand, and this is super simplified, okay, but just for the sake of us having a conversation. uh, Protestant theology is really built on sola scriptura, the
Hmm.
idea that the Bible is the absolute and final authority for all things pertaining to doctrine and morals, and the life of faith. um, The Catholic response to that is no, the church is the final authority, obviously invested in the Pope, but also invested in the teaching authority of the bishops. And so it's like in the Catholic world, it's almost like the Dr. Seuss story where some of the creatures had stars on their bellies and some of them didn't. It's like in the Catholic world, the Bible gets its authority from the church. And then the Protestant world, the church gets its authority from the Bible.
Mm.
And so we're kind of at the point where we're arguing in circles. And now along come the mystics, and the mystics are saying, well, what about the authority of my own experience?
Mm.
And it's
Hmm.
like, neither side wanted to hear
Hmm. Hmm.
that. you know, and so because the reality is that the mystics, I mean, really, as best I can tell, all the way back to the early centuries, the mystics have always skirted on the edge of orthodoxy. That there are. So it's funny. I did a similar interview like the one you and I are having recently with somebody who's very much interested in
Mm.
esoteric history and esoteric spirituality. And so he was really pressing me. He was saying, why don't you talk about the Gnostics? Why don't you talk about the Cathars? Why don't and kind of all these the Rosicrucians, all these kind of heretical movements. And I finally had to say, listen, I'm writing this book for people who are working within the mainstream of Christian orthodoxy. And people who aren't working within the mainstream might think I'm being kind of timid. But for people who are in the mainstream, obviously their perspective is shaped by the Bible, it's shaped by church history, it's shaped by doctrine, and so there have been mystics like some of the ones I've just mentioned that fall beyond the pale of what
Hmm.
is generally considered Orthodox Christianity. But there are also mystics who have become, Howard Thurman is a great example, have become really lauded as in the Catholic world we would say saints. Maybe in the Reformed world you would say, heroes of the faith, or great
Hmm.
teachers, or or more still using the word saint in an informal way. Um, so so there are mystics who get rejected as heretics. There are mystics who get lauded as saints, and there are the ones in the middle. But what I think all three categories have in common is they do tend to dance on that edge of
Hmm.
the authority structure, because historically the institution has to place authority in something that is kind of external, whether
Yeah.
it's the actual institution itself, which is what the Catholics have done, or whether it's the body of sacred writings, which is what the Reformed tradition does.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the Christian mystics who are generally accepted to be Orthodox Christians, and I mean that in the small O sense, not Eastern Orthodox, but just Orthodox within the larger community of faith, are typically the mystics who report their own experiences, but then really work at how their experience is consistent with what they understand kind of Christian teaching to be. So you see
Right.
that with Teresa of Avila, with John of the Cross, you know. But the reality is they're still offering new ways of thinking, new ways of looking, new ways of talking about God.
Mm-hmm.
So they're always dancing this dance. And I mean, Ignatius of Loyola, Teresa of Avila, they had their issues with the Inquisition. It was certainly they didn't have a free ride. We're seeing this with Merton right now. There are a lot of conservative Catholics who just cannot stand Merton.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be kind of fun to, get a sneak peek into 300 years from now, whether Merton will be regarded as a heretic or maybe as a saint, or maybe still it's just somebody who lived on the edges.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he was this devout Trappist monk who also, I mean, he said right before he died, he said, I want to be the best Buddhist I can be.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a Christian like me, that it just opens up doors and possibility. But there are a lot of Christians that freaks them out.
Mm-hmm.
How can you be a student of Buddhism? And again, Merton he's being faithful to the authority of his own experience. He's like, when I pray and when I sit down and do Zen, they're they're supporting each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but you have to experience that before you can go there. And obviously, the shadow side of having external authority is that you create bureaucracy, and you also can instill fear.
Mm-hmm.
And so many. I mean, I have a very dear friend that I've known for years. I just love her to pieces. But she thinks I'm just on the fast track to perdition, because I practice yoga and I study with Buddhists and I meditate, and now in her mind, that stuff, then you belong to the devil. I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
really that's her story.
Mm-hmm.
That's her story. And it's and of course what it has meant is that we don't have a very authentic relationship, because there's whole segments of my life I just can't talk about with her,
Mm-hmm.
because it upsets her too much, and I'm not interested in upsetting her. I don't want to have a fight, but until she deconstructs her story of God, there's not going to be room for my story of God in
Mm-hmm.
in our relationship. So this is part of, I think that's what, to use that as an analogy, I think mystics are always trying to expand the story of God.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the institution or the hierarchy or church leadership, the conference ministers, whatever you want to say, they're running an institution. They're trying to keep the
Mm-hmm.
business going. They got to pay the light bills. You know, they don't have time to worry about expanding our image of God. They
Mm-hmm.
they want to see the butts in the pews on Sunday morning. I know that's vulgar, but
Right.
frankly, it's that's the institution has to pay the bills, and so
Mm-hmm.
so there is a fundamental tension there. And
Mm-hmm.
so
Yeah,
mystics, I
it
think,
seems.
historically have danced that tension. So
Yeah, it seems like throughout history, Christian mystics have always been the troublemakers of Christianity, or at least more often than not, have been the troublemakers of Christianity. And that actually reminds me a lot of the listeners that of this podcast generally are people who grew up in the evangelical tradition and have since left that tradition. Maybe some of them have remained Christian, maybe some of them have left Christianity altogether, but are nonetheless very interested in probably thinking through or learning about the mystics. And I'm curious what you think. I don't know what your experience is with people who are quote unquote like deconstructing their faith or leaving evangelicalism or leaving conservative Christianity. But I would imagine maybe to some degree, especially as a spiritual director, you've worked with some level
oh yeah,
of people
oh
that
yeah.
have that experience. What would you like? What would you say mysticism offers to people that are deconstructing their faith or leaving conservative religious environments?
You know, um, First of all, I would say that I think it can take a lot of courage to deconstruct your faith, and especially moving out of a conservative environment, especially when your family is involved. So first of all, I just want to acknowledge the incredible courage that it takes to do that kind of thing. Um, I would say that. Okay, this just comes to mind. I knew a man once. He was a bishop in the Episcopal Church, and I was taking a class with him, and it was interesting. I don't know. It wasn't even the class wasn't even on marital counseling, but he brings it up. He was trying to illustrate a point, and he said, sometimes when couples would come in for marital counseling, and we talk for a half an hour, and I might have to ask them, and I'd say, "Are you here for marital counseling, or are you here for divorce counseling?"
Mm.
And he didn't mean that with judgment, because hey, we live in a world where marriages break down. And the reality is if your marriage is breaking down, let me counsel you that we can try to do this in as compassionate and as caring a manner as possible. So it's like there's good and bad ways to get a divorce. Um, if your marriage is troubled and you want to save the marriage, that's a different strategy of counseling. So I
Mm-hmm.
hope that analogy makes sense. So I think that when you're deconstructing your faith, that's kind of the first question you have to ask is, do I want to save this marriage, or do I really want to let it go?
Mm.
And my book is probably going to be more helpful to the persons who aren't quite ready to take it out in the back and shoot it. That they still want to have some sort of relationship with the Christian tradition. It may not involve church, you know,
Mm.
that it may involve community that's found online, or I don't know, just going out and hanging out with other people who have had the door slammed in their face and saying, how does God show up in your life, and that's community. um but I think the reality is that, well, we kind of was touching on this earlier when we were talking about the atheists. I I think everybody, even the most conservative person, everybody is continuing. If you're drawing breath, if your mind is functioning, you're continually honing your story.
Mm.
Some people probably do that very slowly and only make very minor tweaks. But others, their world gets rocked. And I give you an example. A very dear friend of mine, a colleague of mine in the Atlanta spiritual direction community, faithful Roman Catholic, never misses a Sunday Mass. Guess what? Her son comes out to her. She has a
Mm.
gay son. And she's like, I realized I don't know very much about, homosexuality, same sex love. And so she took it upon herself and she read some books, visited some websites, did a lot of, learning, saw the kind of hostility towards queer people in the Catholic world. She goes to her priest and she says to her priest, "Don't you dare make me choose between the church and my son. And
Mm.
I'll tell you right now that if you do, I'm choosing my son." And I don't know who the priest was, but to his credit, he said, "I would never ask you to make that choice."
Mm.
10, however many years later, she is now the director of the ministry in the Catholic Archdiocese of Atlanta that basically works with the family and friends of gay Catholics. And it's an affirming ministry. I mean, there are ministries out there like, yes, you should be celibate. That's not this ministry. This is a ministry
Mm.
that says yes to
Wow.
love. And so, and I can tell you this woman would never, I don't think, I'll have to ask her. I don't think she would ever say, "I'm a mystic." And yet clearly she has such a strong relationship with God, as she has experienced and understood God,
Mm.
that she had the strength to literally go and be very vulnerable before an institution that hasn't had a very good track record.
Right.
And has actually been able to create some positive change, obviously on a small level, but still. um, so deconstructing our faith can mean many, many, many different things. You asked me about my ministry, and of course I have to protect people's confidentiality. But I mean, I work with people who are clergy, people who are getting paid by the
Mm-hmm.
church, and they're on a deconstruction journey. Wow, that's very, very interesting. And of course, maybe the right answer is to say, I'm done with ministry. I'm going to go
Mm-hmm.
teach college or go become a therapist or go start a business or whatever. That's legit, you know. But then it might also be, I see enough of value in ministry that I just have to totally, totally write a new story
Mm-hmm.
about what this means and about how I show up and how I'm present with other people. And that's equally legit. But each person has to decide for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Here's an analogy that I like to use. Everybody knows, and I know you know this. Everybody knows. Everybody who's honest knows that institutional Christianity is just in full throttle crisis right now.
Mm-hmm.
I think I heard recently that the Episcopal Church, just to use one example, in the last 10 or 20 years, the Episcopal Church has shrunk by 44%. I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
almost half. It's like it's just barely more than half of what it was a generation ago. At that rate, will there even be an Episcopal Church a few
Mm-hmm.
generations from now? And I think Anglican Christianity is beautiful. It would break my heart to see it just wither away. But that's the reality. The church is in crisis, and it's across the board. And it used to be the conservative churches were growing and the liberal churches were shrinking. Not true
It's all
anymore. Now
shrinking.
that, yeah, now they all are. So here's the analogy. The church is like a burning building. Dumpster fire. The church is a dumpster fire. People like you and me, and I assume the people listening to this podcast, who are really taking responsibility for having an adult faith or an adult relationship to the faith, we are like firefighters. And the question is, number one, do we want to go into the building? And if we're going into the building, why? Are we there to try to save the people that are trapped inside it, help them to get out of the building? Or do we think the building is worth saving and we're going to
Mm.
try to put out the fire and preserve the building? Different people will answer that question in different ways. Who am I to say that there's only one right answer? I respect people who think, the institution is worth saving. Um, but I think it's like, and it's like Notre Dame. When Notre Dame burned, it will be a new church. It will not be what it was before. I'm glad I saw
Mm-hmm.
it before the fire. Because that's just that will be an epical moment in the life of that church. The same thing. I think what Phyllis Tickles, God rest her soul, said that we are basically due for another Reformation, and I think she
Mm-hmm.
was right. And I think we are seeing the beginning of it right now
Mm-hmm.
in our lifetimes, and so for some of us, it's like, there's so much that's of value there. I want to preserve what's of value, even as I let go of what no longer serves. I can really respect that, but I equally can respect those who say, for my own health as well as the people I love, I have to get as far away as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Now, can the mystics help the people who say, look, I need a divorce from the church? I think that, again, it's a personal thing, because you can get divorced from the church and still want to cultivate a relationship with God, a spiritual life. And if you want that, even away from the church, the mystics could be wonderful allies.
Mm-hmm.
Now you have to read the mystics with discernment, because again, so many of them, they're writing centuries ago. They often use the language of the language of sin and redemption, the language of reward and punishment. It's what I would call dualistic language. Yes, mysticism takes us to non-duality, but we have to go through a whole lot of duality to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And so in fact, being back to the silence and speech analogy, you could argue that language is inherently dualistic. And so even the most gifted mystic in their writings, they will be speaking dualistically. And so we have to read them with discernment, just like you have to read anything else.
Mm-hmm.
So so can the mystics support the people who are asking or getting a divorce? Yes, if they want to do that kind of work. Um, but I think they can be especially valuable for the ones who maybe are deconstructing their faith and looking for a way to reconstruct it that maybe is based a little bit more on compassion and a little bit less on reward and
Mm-hmm.
punishment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that last group of people is certainly has been my experience, and I would imagine a lot of people listening to this podcast are probably in that group of folks as well. So, yeah, Christian mysticism has certainly been, especially just the mystics themselves, not only just my personal experiences, but also just reading other mystics has been certainly. I felt a sort of accompaniment in my deconstructing story because of their own stories as well. So I find the mystics really, really important and helpful in that way. Last question, Carl. How can listeners get connected to you and your work?
Yes. Well, obviously the books, which you can find wherever, you know, good books are sold. Um, the My blog is anamkara.com, and that's ANAM as in Mary, so N as in Nancy, M as in Mary, ANAMCHARA.com. It's a Gaelic word that means soul friend.
Hmm.
Um, and my podcast, which has been on hiatus for the last few months, but I know we do intend to bring a few more episodes out, but it's called Encountering Silence. And so you can find all the old, I mean, we interviewed people like Richard Rohr, Cynthia Bourgeot, Martin
Mhm.
Laird, Jim Finley, a lot of, and Barbara Holmes, Loretta Coleman Brown, a lot of amazing contemporary contemplatives have been interviewed on that podcast. So that would be the main thing. And yeah, so Anam Cara, Encountering Silence, and then the books. So.
Love it, love it. Well, thank you so much, Carl, for chatting more about Christian mysticism. Again, I don't think this topic really has been explored so much on this podcast. So, thank you so much for chatting more about it. And certainly, the book is great and probably one of the best intros I've read in terms of Christian mysticism. So, thank you so much for writing it and chatting more about it.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you, Mason.